Right. Now, anyone can call out, send a chat, raise their hand, yell, hey you, stop, anytime they like, if they want to ask a question or have something further to contribute to the content. But essentially what I've selected today is to go through the pattern called interrupt buffer, and that pattern is available on the Scrum plot website, and we also see it being used in different ways, I guess. But we're going to go with a pure pass-through of its intended use. And I guess with that in mind, there are some activities in here that we might need to sort of jump on and contribute to. So what I might do is quickly share in the chat the link for this so that you can join as a participant. And you're going to get some form of exciting visiting hippo or something like that going on. Okay, so feel free to join that. Most of the screens are locked. There is content that will move around, so just be conscious of that as we're going through. But the outline really takes us through the content, and so I'm going to stick to that. So just the agenda for today. Looking at this here, it's not the type of buffer that we're talking about. But in terms of the interrupt buffer, we're going to go through how we size interruptions, and interruptions can come from multiple different sources, and we'll get to that in a second. But what is the role that is involved in prioritizing those interruptions? When the buffer runs out, what do we do then? And also, I guess understanding why would we introduce this type of a concept when we're managing our sprints, either as a product owner, Scrum Master, or a team member. So with that in mind, we'll move on. And the first activity is one of those interactive type activities. So once you've jumped in, Anisha, can see that you're in as well. But I guess what type of interruptions are out there? That's kind of the data that I'm looking to get. So when you've experienced running in the Scrum team environment, what sort of interruptions occur when you're going through your sprint? And I guess, for want of a better word, some form of change is requested to the sprint goal or to the sprint backlog. And where do these interruptions come from? You can yell them out if you're having trouble with connecting.
Yes, I'm having trouble just logging me in and out. So I'm writing my message in the chat. Like, would you consider a spike as an interrupt? Or is it a solution to an interrupt, Jason?
Well, if it's introduced partway through the sprint, it could be.
Okay, yeah, that's what I was thinking, because at times, what happens?
So an investigation
or
a spike. And where would that come from, do you think? Who would be a stakeholder that would be trying to do to introduce this?
This probably would be my technical manager or tech guy, whoever it is mostly.
Yeah, okay. So maybe we can call him a solution designer or architect.
Yep. Yeah, that would be appropriate.
Tech lead of some variety.
Yep.
Yeah. What other type of interruptions are there?
Other one that I can think of and that I've felt it across is like, because I'm working in an environment where 3 teams working in parallel towards a product at times, something like these interruptions that you receive because of COVID, somebody is not able to work, or somebody's offsite because of the thing that they're still getting tested after traveling from Melbourne or to Melbourne. Would you consider that as an interrupt? And it's mostly like you would think everything through, like everything is okay, Victoria, and Adelaide travel is fine, but then suddenly something goes off, and then you can't find a person because that person who should have been available on site cannot be there.
Might do that, yeah. And that's a great, I hadn't considered that one as potentially something that someone would raise. It's actually really good to highlight that, because mainly it is a change to what you predicted, and so that's something to consider. But I guess interrupts are a bit more designed around new work coming in and how to.
Okay, all right.
Yeah, so that there's probably another pattern out there for that one, and maybe that would be a good brown bag for next time. But yeah, in this case, it's kind of like a source of work, and I guess a stakeholder that would be asking for it.
Yep. Agree. No, that's a good lever.
Yeah, so it might be that you're discovering some through stakeholder feedback. You're going through your sprint and somebody has been called in, subject matter expertise, and says, oh, I've got this great idea, how about we do this? Right, so perhaps maybe it's a case of having new requirements from business.
Okay.
What else might it be? Get
a
three.
Pivot in the strategy. Would you call that as an interrupt, where a release plan was changed abruptly because of a certain strategic move?
Yeah, and which changes the scope?
Yes. I've had quite a few across government.
Oh, I bet. So in that context, we're talking about maybe a business
scope
direction
change due to business direction or business strategy change.
Yeah. Okay. Maybe that's a sponsor. Something like that. All right. So we've got a bit of an idea of what the types of interruptions are now, and we'll kind of narrow it down on the different types of scope changes that might occur. Maybe there's a maintenance request.
Yep, sure.
There are things like those sorts of things that come in. Maybe there's a change, product change from marketing.
Yeah.
Changes to see, or that sort of thing. And
would you consider something like, because now that I'm working in government, I feel it's very important and it holds the highest values, something that leads to a change because of a certain news being made or certain kind of feedback received from the end user?
Yep. Okay, excellent. All right, we've got some really good concepts to play with there. So let's have a look at the next one. So I know everybody on the call, and yeah, I know that you would understand this bit. So I just wanted to put it into context first, though. So when we look at the establishment and prioritization of the product backlog, we get a lot of different sort of readiness activities, so, we might do customer interviews, UX prototyping, we might get feedback from the business, we might conduct spikes to investigate something or to prove a hypothesis. The team might do refinement. All of those sorts of things lead to us creating the product backlog. And clearly the product owner would be involved in helping through the relationships across the business, helping understand what the priorities are, and also understanding from the priorities from within the team on sequencing as well. So understanding technically, there are dependencies, inter-team dependencies that need to occur. And so therefore that plays a part in the priority order as well.
Yep.
We then have our next artifact, which is establishing the sprint backlog and the sources of content or PBIs, product backlog items. For the sprint backlog might be made up of continuous improvement ideas from the retrospective. It would be pulling your high priority items from the product backlog. And you can see there, a couple of them have gone in from the top of the backlog, but perhaps maybe there's a bit of a sequencing decision that needed to occur for the team there, which meant that we didn't take the third item, but rather the fifth, because it made more sense in releasing something of value at the end of the sprint.
Mm-hmm.
Essentially, with the buffer, it's a way of creating some space within your sprint. And, you know, you might have different concepts on how you've done this before, whether it's a percentage or whatever. But the idea of creating that buffer is really to allow some capacity so that the unknowns have got somewhere to go if something becomes a really high priority. Now, George, you are hovering over that weather symbol there. That's intentionally there, or whilst it looks a little bit out of place. There's another pattern called yesterday's weather. And yesterday's weather is a great source of information to understand how much of a buffer you should create. So based on historical data, the last few sprints or, you know, something like that, we might get an idea of the difference between how many story points or stories that we committed to at the start of the sprint and how many story points entered the sprint after the sprint started, essentially coming from the sources of different interruptions. So yesterday's weather, looking at things reflectively, is a great source of information to understand what sort of a buffer do you need.
Yep.
Now enter the product owner. Now product owner here, he looks a little bit like Basil Fawlty, or perhaps maybe me with shorter hair and a smaller moustache. But I'm thinking of this from when you look at the type of activities that a product owner would normally do, is they're going through, they're understanding whether, you know, a story has met the definition of done, tick. A story might be still being collaborated on, so there's a lot of questions and answers from the team, and we would really encourage that product owner inside the team, working side by side and progressing things as the sprint progresses, rather than them just checking in at the end of the sprint or something like that. So more of a conversation and understanding of acceptance criteria and the story content itself to be able to get to the definition of done. And so in this case, we've determined that there's a buffer. We'll call the buffer X. It could be 5 points. It could be 8 points. Depends on what yesterday's weather tells us as a good guide. Now, what happens as you're progressing through the sprint? When you get these little gremlins, the interrupt monsters, all right, they come in and they go, oh, I've got a maintenance request. It's really important. Poor old product owner here, he's scratching his head. He goes, oh, what am I supposed to do with these interruptions? But as with creating the product backlog, the priority order of that product backlog is done by the product owner. As far as interruptions coming in, product owner is really the person who's best placed to be able to make the decision with collaboration from the team on what interrupt monsters should enter into buffer X. Okay, so there's a bit of a prioritization call there. So when we understand, what are the priorities?
Quick question, Jason.
Yes,
so the depiction that has been put here for buffer X, is it right to say that this is for a fairly mature team, for the fact that they understand the importance of this buffer X?
Great question. Yeah, so when I referred to yesterday's weather, and it is a great question, yesterday's weather might be looking at the previous sprints to understand what you feel it is and relatively estimate what buffer X is. Mm-hmm. You can, as a newer team or a team that's coming to maturity, the buffer might be a little larger because the element of the unknowns or the complexity or the maturity in one respect. So the buffer might be determined based on, in the last sprints, we've seen an extra 5 points come in consistently from interruptions. So we might give it 5.
Yeah, it seems like a double-edged sword, and I'm happy to have further discussions if you have any time later.
Sure.
Because if I put a buffer in, it becomes a tendency for team to, consume that buffer over the engaged user story for the sprint. And I've seen this pattern often with the high-tech teams. They would want to, take something from the tech debt side and still call it as part of the story because they have to rewrite the API. Is there a certain reflection available on this in terms of how to first identify this as a Scrum Master or a coach, and how to tackle that?
Yes,
maybe
absolutely.
Not a discussion point for this conversation that you're having, but
no, I think it's appropriate actually. There is actually some more stuff coming up that that sort of talks to what the rules might be, and having working agreements in place and things like that. So I'll move on because that question might be answered, and then I'll check in with you again in a second to see if that covered it.
Sure.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for the question. I look at this here, and I guess, the confused product owner is going, look at all these gremlins, all these interrupt monsters. What do I do with it? So there is an element of priority. So the first line of defense against the interrupt monsters, so to speak, really is that prioritization mechanism. So is it a high priority? In which case, let's add it to the buffer X, buffer 5 points, maybe the interrupt is 1 point. It might be a lower priority and it's not aligned to the sprint goal. And so the product owner might say, okay, well, this is important, but we don't have to do it this sprint, so we'll defer it. And that's with collaboration from the stakeholder as well, because the stakeholder will have an understanding or a feeling around the urgency, but it's up to the product owner to determine whether it's, the next sprint is only ever 2 weeks away, is a bit of a guideline for that conversation. There might be interrupts as well that just don't make sense. And, probably seen some of those as well. And in that case, we wouldn't want to add it to the backlog. We would just simply say, we acknowledge that that's a request and we are consciously making a decision not to do it. And so we put it into a remove status, or we put it in the won't do bin, or we just delete it, depending on how you record that sort of scope decision. And everyone's got their own method for that. One of the things that I've experienced, and I wanted to share this experience or this framework in a way with you. This Scrum pattern is also known as Illigitimus non-interruptus. So I thought I'd have a bit of a play of words on that and call it Criterius bufferus interruptus. And so the way that I've gone about this in the past is that, if you can't agree on whether it should go into the buffer or should go into the backlog, you can use questions like this and rules like this to get to a determination as to whether it goes in the buffer or what happens later on. I'll just zoom in on this one, just so you can see it a little bit better. So can't agree, we're going to do the 3. Sounds like a swimming ad from Australia, but anyway. So number 1, can it be done with the remaining points within the story that it might be related to? So that might be that, you've discovered something within what you're delivering, and it might just be as simple as, oh, that's not on brand and we need to change color, right? Can it be done within the points? Yeah, it can. It's not a significant scope change. So we don't even need to add that to the buffer. Question number 2 is the definition of done achievable within the remaining buffer? Okay, so have we got enough time left in the sprint to do the piece of work right through to the definition of done, or is it going to be a carryover risk? Number 3 is, was the whole team or the team that is going to have to do the work involved in the commitment within this sprint? Now, The golden rule here is, and this is the most important bit, is that if it's a yes to all of these questions, let's give it a go and we'll learn. If there is a no to any of these questions, so can it be done within the remaining points? Is definition of done achievable within the remaining time? And, was it just a developer that made that decision, or was the tester involved as well, as the VA involved as well? Whoever it might be in the team for your context. If the answer to any of these three questions is no, pop it on the backlog. It will go back in through prioritization with the product owner. And it may be that it's just that important and it comes in the next sprint. It's only ever 2 weeks away. All right, careful, Captain. She's going to blow. What do we do when the buffer is getting full? Okay, so we've accepted some change, but there's a change that's likely to blow the buffer. It's likely to fill the buffer or go even just 1 point above the buffer capacity. What do you think that we would do?
You would probably not use that. You'll just
yeah,
there are ways to it, which is if you want to pull something out to bring this in, which is prioritizing what you have given, what you have been provided by the interrupt monsters. So if you're saying you might do a quick reprioritization exercise and actually find that the pull that you had for a 5-pointer.
Yeah. And yeah,
so that's one way of looking at it.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you think about, if you were to do that, you would have to replan the sprint, wouldn't you? You'd have to go, well, I'm actually changing the context of my commitment now. And really you need the team involved to have everybody involved in doing the remaining work recommit to a change of vision for that sprint or a change of goal for that sprint. In the alternative, it's that, the product owner is not really, it's 1 point above, what's the worst thing that can happen? I wish I had a sound effect for this thing, more like a, anyway. So the buffer blows, right? We're all of a sudden, we're back to where we were, accepting interruptions without consequence, positive or negative, all right? So what we need to do in that case is we need to have a hard line approach to aborting the sprint. So we abort the actual current sprint commitment, replan the sprint with the team for the remaining time, and recommit to the scope for, or the sprint goal for the remaining time of the sprint. It's a hard line though, and I'd imagine that some of the key elements to consider here are that you really need to have those rules in place first. All right, so number one here is really talking about determining the number of interrupts and story points. So that's really looking at yesterday's weather, making a determination on what is feasible in terms of story points for a buffer. And guess what? If you get it wrong, you get to readjust it the next sprint and it'll get better. The product owner still has the role in playing to play in triaging those interrupts. We need to estimate them. We need to understand, is it important enough to go through that effort right now, or pop it on the backlog and do it as part of your refinement activities and your sprint planning in the future. We want to, and this is where I was coming into having some rules and ground and guidance, is creating working agreements with the different interrupt sources. Like, you're probably going to have key stakeholders that you want to really get them to understand what the rules are here, because nobody likes the idea of being responsible or accountable for aborting a sprint. And I reckon I've only ever done it once. And it's not a good feeling. And
I was about to ask you that question.
And there's nobody that really likes that from a client point of view or a customer point of view or a team point of view. Everyone's deflating, it's demotivating. that sort of thing. So there's an invested interest in making sure you've got those working agreements in place. And I guess product owner and even Scrum Master should be involved in stakeholder management in that respect. Really important here is, you know, as per one of the Scrum values, have the courage to enforce those rules. Don't be afraid of the transparent moment where you have to make a decision because people know based on the working agreement what the rules are. It would actually be detrimental to the process if you didn't have the courage to follow through on that discipline. Okay. And I think this talks a little bit to your comment before, Manish, is that if yesterday's weather suggests, start lowering your buffer size. Like if the interrupt starts slowing down because, hey, you know, you're following the rules and everything's working nicely, you can start to bring the buffer size down over time. It actually helps the team from finishing this sprint early, and they can start pulling new scope items from the backlog. So rather than making a determination on whether something should interrupt the sprint first finish the work and then introduce the scope. And maybe that's a better way of understanding the priority and saying, hey, if we've got a chance, maybe this is a priority decision moment. If we've got a chance, we'll bring that in. I'll put up in the backlog. But if we get a chance, we'll bring it in. But if not, we'll prioritize it into the next sprint.